Well, we've seen the Orb videos and we've heard from the debunkers. Today, we have the privilege of talking with a 10-year expert on this MH370 case, discussing more than whether or not the Orb videos are real, but actually what the heck happened to this disappearing plane. So today, we are featuring the author of the book, The Taking of MH370, one of the lead investigators featured in the Netflix documentary, MH370, The Plane That Disappeared, our friend, Mr. Jeff Wise. Jeff, thank you so much for joining us. If you could tell us a little bit about yourself, and why don't you start with, why are you so obsessed with MH370?
Wow, everybody wonders that, including my wife, including me, actually. This story does have its hooks in me. Look, I'm a journalist. I've been doing journalism for a long time. I got my degree in biology, and I thought I would do science, and then I kind of got the travel bug, and I became kind of an adventure travel journalist, and then I got my pilot's license, and I got really interested in plane crashes. A lot of people who get their pilot's licenses are like, this could kill me. How do I prevent that from happening? I think I'll read all of these, NTSB reports, and then if you're a freelance journalist, your kind of instinct is always to see if I can sell an article about this thing that I happen to be interested in anyway. So that became one of my things. But a freelance journalist is like by nature kind of, I like to say like an inch deep and a mile wide. Like I'm sort of interested in everything. And then this really strange crash called Air France 447 happened. This plane disappeared. And it was a huge mystery, and it took 2 years to solve it, and the solution was pretty amazing. I mean, amazing is maybe a bad word to use for an event that killed hundreds of people, but...
And that was before 2014.
That was in 2009, and it had some real kind of uncanny resonances with MH370, actually. But I kind of got some attention for that, and then when MH370 disappeared... CNN was basically any warm body that they could put in that seat. That was all they wanted to talk about. That was all the viewers wanted to watch. Anytime they started to talk about something else, like the audience would leave in droves. So like, oh, we have to feed the beast. So I was going on like 5 times a day for like a month or two, and then, but. Why this mystery? I did 31 episodes in the first season, and I feel like we've barely scratched the surface. I didn't even get to talk about the people on board the plane yet.
Sure.
You're talking about your own podcast, right?
I'm talking about my own podcast, yeah. The first season was called Deep Dive MH370, and I just started season 2, which is called Finding MH370. And it is a case that is important. It matters that planes can vanish into thin air. We really want to know why. It has a huge human interest angle. I mean, 239 people have vanished, and all of their loved ones are left behind. But it's also, I'm a science writer. So science journalists, as I said, inch deep, mile wide, like marine biology, satellite dynamics, satellite communications, the Doppler effect, human psychology. The case is itself
the hows and the whys, right? That just fascinates you.
The hows and whys, but it just requires such an entire. It's like it requires a whole science channel worth of science, and so I find myself talking to experts, talking to people who know. Like it turns out that the 777 has the pieces of electronics on board this plane are connected by a data bus called an AirInc 629.
Yes.
That is not something you would ever need to know. But it turns out to be extremely relevant and really actually important to this case.
Yes.
And so this is a case where the devil is in the details. And this is why we call the first season Deep Dive MH370, because the point that everyone who's involved in this case is trying to kind of push their solution, their answer for the mystery. And yes, I do have my particular theory that I think is true, but more than that, what I'm trying to really generate enthusiasm for is an approach to dealing with a mystery, which is basically to slow down, roll up your sleeves, do the work. This is an incredibly intricate case. It's a really fascinating case too. I mean, if you're willing to come along on the ride, all of these details, the life cycle of a Lepus antiphora barnacle is the most arcane and obscure thing in the world, but it actually happens to tell you something really, really interesting about this case. So what I'm saying is to people is like, if you like science, if you like hearing getting really granular, this is the mystery for you, because we have to get super granular.
Well, I'm excited.
Well, yeah, I mean, we're very excited to dive into this, and you just touched on like almost every angle of the flowchart I have in front of me. So what I wanted to start, and I don't know if you've been able to catch some of our last episodes, and into the intro, I touched on it a little bit, right?
Right.
These famous Orb videos. I don't know how much time we'll spend talking about that today, but I want to get your kind of comment on that, because that's how we all got involved in this. And that's how Mike and I kind of said, well, what's going on over here? And so certain figures are definitely propping up those videos. And you just mentioned that when we need to follow this scientific process and go dive through the evidence and then come out with a story that makes sense. Well, what I would say is actually, as unbelievable as these Orb videos may seem, or the science behind it, and what I do give them credit for is that they are able to kind of form a story and form a narrative and at least come up with some solution, right? After we talked to that gentleman we had on, what happened is we brought on one of the people that claims that those Orb videos are fake, and they debunked these videos. So what I felt was they did a significantly good job, or I should say sufficiently good job, debunking those videos, in my opinion, and they likely are faked. But what they don't do is come up with a story about what happened to the plane. And I know that's not their job, right? To debunk a video is what they're trying to do. They're virtual effects artists. But at the same time, you want to have an answer to this burning question. So I really would like to start from the beginning and, go all the way back to 2014. So can you tell us a little bit about the actual search efforts that went on? How did they direct those? And I want to know, so we've heard about the seventh arc, right? Et cetera, all these different options and search paths. But, where does this story start, right? Jeff, help us out. Where do we start?
The question that you've just asked me is a question that I spent 31 episodes addressing, and I'm still, like I said, I'm barely started. Even to tell you the basics of what happened to this plane is like the gist I could tell you. A plane took off after midnight, 40 minutes into its flight to Beijing. It went electronically dark, did a 180, flew back over the Malayan Peninsula, flew up the Malacca Strait, left Malaysian primary radar. This box that usually never gets turned off gets turned back on again. The plane either goes north or it goes south. The scientists study these electronic signals that are very unusual. They've never been created in this way before. They do some crazy complicated math. The math says that the plane went south. And not only does it say that it went south, it says that it went into a very particular part of the ocean. The scientists say, hooray, hallelujah, we have the answer, we've solved the math. It's like when you get the solution on your math test and the teacher gives you 100 and an A+ and a gold star. So they're very happy. So in a celebratory mood, they go and search the seabed, and the plane isn't there. And so that's where we stand today. It's like we thought we had solved it, and then it turned out we didn't. Or maybe we just made a wrong assumption, but which wrong assumption did we make? Now, that is the basic gist of the story. There's many, many complicating parts to this story. One of them is me, because as I was covering this story back in 2014, I noticed some pieces of it were really odd. I noticed, for instance, that this box, which had never been turned off before, was also turned back on, implied a kind of sophistication, that whoever was on board this plane knew way more than any 777 captain I've ever talked to knows about these planes.
And just so we're on the same page, that box you're referring to, that's the satellite ping, is that right?
It's called the Satellite Data Unit. It's part of the SATCOM system. People in MH370 world have long arguments about what you should call it. People get mad at me for calling it the SATCOM, but nobody's ever heard of the SDU. Anyway, I went on CNN. I went on international TV in March of 2015, and I said, guys, I know that you think that these signals tell you that the plane went south, but I just want you to be aware that there's a way that these signals could have been tampered with. And if they were tampered with, you're not going to find a plane on the southern seabed. And everyone said, you are a jerk and a lunatic. And I actually got kicked out of this group of like self-described experts who had kind of come together. I want to do a whole episode on this, actually, because they were mad at me for saying that they might not find it on the southern seabed. And I thought, okay, this is scary, because the minute they do find it on the southern seabed, I'm going to look very stupid. But I also felt like, listen, it's my kind of moral duty because I see something that people don't perceive, and I need to point it out to them because if what I'm saying is true, and I don't know that it's true, but I'm saying it could be true, I have a moral obligation to say so because the implications are actually scary as hell. To make a long story short, they didn't find it, but nobody came to apologize to me. And so here I am 10 years later still trying to explain what the hell I'm talking about.
There's two things I want to point out. I think, like, listening to the first 31 episodes, I like this kind of summary is just everywhere the plane was supposed to be, it wasn't. And then I like a particular analogy that you made is that it feels like you're trying to figure out, am I working on a real jigsaw puzzle or are these just a bunch of random pieces? And whether you follow official narrative or any of these theories, they seem to require you start with one conclusion or one piece of data that you just blindly, believe, and then you make all of the other pieces fit. Whether you want to believe what the Inmarsat data says, then the drift patterns and the pieces found don't make any sense. The life forms and the growth patterns, all of it, they don't connect. And that's the fascinating part to me is that it is a true mystery in every sense.
I appreciate that. I think that's really a good way to put it.
So that brings me to one of the questions we had, and it was one thing that we've talked about a lot in your podcast, and I hope you can help our listeners understand what you mean when you say it. So Bayesian analysis, right? And I think that's kind of what we're talking about here. What is that?
Bayesian analysis is a really important concept that is fundamental to science as it's done in the 21st century, but it's not intuitive in a way that people are usually used to. I have a kid who's in 10th grade chemistry, and his teacher gave a talk to the parents, and she was like, we do the scientific method, which is basically you have a hypothesis, you do a test, and then tells you whether the hypothesis is correct or not. That's actually that is not incorrect, but it kind of misses like a lot of the subtleties of how science actually works, because in the real world you might have information coming in, but you don't know how accurate that information is, and you're using it to test a model that might not be the only model that is possible. And so there's much more uncertainty that exists in the world, and Bayesian inference is a way to kind of deal with that. And it's sometimes called reverse probability. And so normal probability is you have a pair of dice and you throw it. And I would say if I say to you, what's the probability that you get a 9? You can just make a table of all the possibilities and figure out like it's a such and such percentage, right? If it's a 6, I'll have one die. It's a 1 out of 6 or 16% chance, right? So Bayesian it works differently. And an example that I read that was pretty good, I thought, was imagine you have a pool table and you have a billiard ball that's like 1 foot from the end of the pool table. And the thing that you don't know is how long the pool table is. And so using Bayesian, so say you happen to know that all the pool tables in the world are either 10 feet long or 8 feet long, and they're of roughly equal percentage. Now you could actually work using this kind of Bayesian thing. You could actually figure out the probability that you've got an 8-foot table just from the fact that the billiard ball is 1 foot from the end. It's hard for me. One of the challenges of me is that when the scientists were trying to work from this data set that they had, which, as I said, had never been produced by a plane before or since, and they were trying to work out where they should look for this plane, and they used this Bayesian model. They did some things that it's really hard to explain to people why their conclusions are valid. Here's an analogy I gave to somebody the other day. Imagine that all I know about you is that your aunt gives you $1 every birthday. And the question is let's say there's two possibilities. She either gives you $1 bill or she reaches into her jar and gives you a fistful of change without counting it, without looking at it. She just grabs a fistful of money and gives you those coins. So, and every year for the last 10 years, you've gotten exactly $1. So which method has she used? Now you might say, well, if she gave you exactly $1, it seems really unlikely that it would just be like because you would think if she grabs a fistful of change, it's going to be 72 cents one year and $1.13 the next year. You know what I'm saying?
Right.
So you could actually work out the relative probability. So basically, Bayesian is called reverse probability in the sense it's like I know what the world is right now. How did it get here? How did I get to this current state of affairs that I find myself in? So basically, the scientists had these set of data, the 7 pings that were sent by the plane, and they said, okay, what are the conditions that gave rise to this? We know that the plane at point X in time was Y kilometers from the satellite. What's the universe of possible things that might have happened to get it there? And so I'm trying to explain this, and it's to me really interesting, because this is how the world actually works. But for a lot of people who see a video on YouTube or on TikTok that shows orbs spinning around a plane, it looks amazing. Like I don't have to worry about any of that crazy stuff. I just see the answer. It's UFOs, and then, you know, it goes through a time portal. So that's awesome.
Sure.
So, yeah, I mean, that's kind of what I was saying, right? They've been able to come up with this story, and maybe you're right. We're jumping to these conclusions and then filling in the blanks based on what we want the answer to be. So, yeah, I mean, you joke, right? You've been spending the last 10 years and countless hours on podcasts trying to figure this out. But do I understand you correctly when you talk about those Emersat pings? Are you saying that these maybe aren't to be trusted or aren't the specific pings?
It was a very interesting time in the early months after the plane disappeared. Information was leaking out from the authorities. They weren't being very transparent, and things were coming out in dribs and drabs. They had discovered this new math. They had figured out this methodology. They had collected this data. We didn't know what the data was. We didn't know what the methodology was. And so when they came out and said, oh, we know that the plane went into the southern Indian Ocean, all the passengers are dead, we were like, all the people who were trying to, you know, remotely figure out what the hell was going on based on these tea leaves that were coming out of the authorities, we were like, this sounds very fishy. Eventually, the authorities, the dribs and drabs came out. They published these reports that wound up being quite comprehensive and complete, and they wrote scientific papers explaining the Bayesian method and so forth. But when we realized how their methodology worked, it involved sending signals, and then I can get as complicated as you want to get, but basically,
is this the BTO and BFO data?
BFO and BTO, and from the BFO, there's a very complicated bunch of math that you can do. It has to do with the frequency at which these signals are received. And there's two things that can change the frequency that it's received at. One is the relative speed of the plane and the satellite. That's very simple physics.
Sure.
And there's another part that's it gets way more weird, which is the plane doesn't want the satellite to see a shift in frequency. So it does something called Doppler precompensation, which again, incredibly, never in your life would you ever have had to worry about this. But it's essential to the core of the MH370 mystery. There's an algorithm in this box that got turned off and back on again that is basically taking the plane's position and location and velocity and calculating how much it should change the frequency. And to make a long story short, it's already not a short story, but to make a long story, medium story, the system wasn't working correctly because the satellite was in orbit for too long and it had run low on fuel. And so because the system wasn't working properly, a navigational clue had seeped into a signal that wasn't supposed to have a navigational clue. And from this, the scientists determined where the plane went. However, the thing that I had perceived, which is that there's a way, because if the 777 is a very unusual plane. It has one of the worst cybersecurity. It's the worst plane for cybersecurity. It's the most insecure plane in the world. And there's an unlocked hatch in the front of the passenger compartment. If you go through that hatch, you have access. You're physically in front of all of the computers that run this plane, the communications, flight controls, everything. And I've people, because of my podcast, people have been coming forward and telling me about the technical details, stuff that I had no idea about in 2014. So the essence of this is that this is why I realized back in 2014 that it's possible to fake this signal. It's possible to get into these boxes and change a parameter so that the plane looks like it's going south when it really went north. I'm saying it's physically possible that there, through a mechanism that we can identify, that some very, very clever, sophisticated, malicious person could have taken this plane and made it seem like it was going south. This is why I went on air and said, guys, if you don't find this plane, there's a possible, I have an explanation for maybe why that you might want to look at.
Okay, but so wouldn't that assume that someone's actively hacking the location data of the airplane, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they're overtaking the flight path or right where it's actually going. They're not taking control of the plane. It's just more or less how they're communicating with the satellites.
Right. So presumably if someone were to do this, they would also be taking control of the plane and making it fly north. Yes, you would have to. So you're not only taking control of the communications, you're also taking control of the actual flight controls. But all the boxes that do all of those things are in the same place.
They could potentially do that.
No, I think you touched on a really good part, right? So we got the kind of discrepancies in the Inmarsat data, the BTO and BFO values, and why that would lead to like the seabed search failure, right? So again, the story of the plane was never where it was supposed to be according to every next search effort. So I think that the next problem that, or inconsistency, I should say, in the whole story that you covered and summarized very nicely in episode 31, but I don't want to give away, everything from your first season, but the debris gap, I thought that was a really good thing. Right. There's just too many funny things there. And we came up with this funny line here, just to kind of summarize it all, is how big is the Lepus? How big is your Lepus, right? Like it all boils down to that.
Well, I mean, how big is your Lepus is definitely one of the core things. After the season wrapped, I was sort of sitting with myself and I was like, the thing that to me is the smoke and gun of this case, like the hard physical piece of evidence that is kind of unequivocal, is the fact that when the Flaperon was washed ashore, it was completely covered in Lepus particles. Quite apart from the issue of how big the Lepus particles were, the fact that they were on all surfaces, I am convinced. I don't know if you guys are water people. Do you guys like spend time around boats or anything like that?
I'm down in Miami. I'm right near the water.
Okay. So if you own something that spends time in the ocean for more, you don't just pull it out every day, but if you leave it in the water, you will know that stuff will grow on it. Even if you put on like anti-fouling paint, stuff will grow. Lepus barnacles in particular don't grow on things that stick up out of the water. Things have a water line. There's a water line. And things under the water line have watery things growing on them, and things above the water line tend in the ocean environment to be pretty scoured clean, actually. It's really hard to grow on that. So the fact that there's no water line on the Flaperon. So I was talking to a guy. There's a guy named Green Dot.
Yep.
Very, very smart young guy. He does aviation videos. He got 6 million views for his MH370 video. And anyway, he titled his 6 million view podcast episode what Netflix got wrong about it. So I reached out to him and I said, what did we get wrong? I mean, what you're describing in your video was exactly what we talked about in episode 1.
Guess they didn't listen, huh?
Anyway. Well, he was very nice. We had a long chat. And I was trying to, he does not want to listen to what I'm saying. But he said to me, what would you do? What would you do to try to resolve the mystery? And I said, this is what I think I want to do. I want to get like a Patreon or a GoFundMe or something. Get enough money to build 6 Flaperons or 5 Flaperons, some number of Flaperons. Rig them up with like satellite links and a little camera and a GPS, where it is. Get some friendly people in Australia to drive out as far as they can from Perth. Put these things in the water and wait. And I think that what you're going to find is that there's going to be a water line in every single one of them. And none of them is going to look like the thing that washed ashore. And then hopefully that would be enough of a stunt with a very clear black and white result that people would say, oh yeah, this is funny. Maybe we should start thinking about this again.
Didn't they drop debris and do float patterns, track all that stuff?
Right. So there was an issue with that methodology, right? Yeah.
And I emailed the guy who was in charge of it. And to my surprise, he answered me and with some alacrity got back to me. And I was like, do you see a problem with the fact that these barnacles were supposedly growing up in the dry air? And he said, no, there was they were splashed, probably. They were splashed with water. I'm like, anyway. I said to why didn't you leave them in the water? It's because there was nothing we could learn from that. They had an actual Flaperon. They put it in the water. They took movies. I have some of the footage of the thing floating, and it would have been the easiest thing in the world to just let it go. Let it go. Just let it go. I mean, tie a string to it if you don't want to send a boat out to go get it, but just see how it floats and see what grows on it. I don't know if they really honestly. There's two possibilities. Either they don't even are completely unable to conceive of the possibility that they've got this thing wrong, or they're terrified that they've got this thing wrong and they just don't want to do anything about it.
Yeah, it's a convenient truth to say. We don't know, because if they admit it, well, we either know or we either really don't know. It reveals vulnerabilities in either case. So from a government point of view, yeah.
It's a common theme where there's one party seems to latch on one thing and they never let it go, and they try to build the rest of the story around that. And in this instance, like you said, I remember listening from your cast, it's the trailing edge. No matter what orientation that it's even rotating, it's never in the air. So this whole splashing method it's
never in the water. Yeah. So how do these things get? And also the thing that's cool about lepus I hadn't realized is that you think of barnacles like they're kind of plant-like, they just are stuck. But when they're juveniles, they're like little bugs, and they roam around and they find a nice spot. It's not like a seed that just kind of randomly lands. They can choose where they want to go, and they're not going to choose an air. You know?
So I have a little tidbit. It's definitely off topic, but did you know the barnacle has the largest penis to body size ratio in the entire animal kingdom? They're well endowed. So you didn't know. Good.
I didn't want to bring it up.
No, there's a lot of different questions around the debris.
I will say, though, that the study that found that did not include me as a
subject. Well, then, the methodology is clearly flawed.
I was not measured for that.
Sample size was too small.
Too many dependent variables.
Exactly.
So there's a lot of questions around specifically that Flaperon. I mean, a lot of other pieces of debris washed up. Frankly, they were found, I think it was in the documentary, by somewhat of a questionable Blaine Alan Gibson, the name was. So we do want you to go into that. But first, just tell me, how Ashton described it on our show is that it was literally above the water, like here, and it was kind of being pushed like a sail. So we're saying that this part here is above the water, and it also had barnacles on it, though. And that's the problem, right?
Not just barnacles, but like big barnacles, like healthy barnacles. Normally, like when things float in the water, I spent a lot of time looking for things of different shapes, because the idea was like the kind of conventional, like when I point these things out, when I point out these strange things that seem to be really hard to explain, the inevitable answer is it's just one of those things. Like, why don't any of these pieces have the marine life you'd expect to see in any other population of debris? It's just one of these things. Yeah, I don't know. Another way they say it is there must be a perfectly good explanation.
There always seems to be.
So yeah. Yeah, so I was looking, so like, so the response was, well, it must have been floating kind of like awash, like it was. You can imagine a board that's floating on the surface, and it's like part of it is kind of sticking up, but like it's sticking up so little that like any wave would kind of make it wet. So barnacles or maybe can deal with that. But even things that float like that have an area where like they're happy, then they're not so happy, and then they're really unhappy, and then they just don't exist.
Yeah, that gradation doesn't seem to be there. But then also I do want to settle something, because there is some contestation. Was that what did we use to determine the veracity that Flaperon is almost certainly from the plane? Because I know initially there were some part numbers on the outside that weren't a certain match, but maybe there was some other serial numbers that were discovered.
The piece originally had a little plaque on the outside that was missing when it was recovered, and I think Florence Tishanghi, the French journalist, thought this was like impossible. Things do just happen. I mean, it is true that like when all of the coincidences all point in the same direction, then you start to wonder. But coincidences happen all the time. Can a nameplate fall off? I think it probably can, honestly. But on the inside, there were serial numbers that matched like handwritten notes in the assembly factory in Spain that had made this part. So I think it's unique to this part. To me, it settles it conclusively. To get rid of, there's always the tendency to want to get rid of evidence that doesn't match what you're saying, what you want to believe, right? And we have to resist that temptation. So I think it's pretty conclusively been established that it did come from MH370.
What makes it tough to grapple with, right, is that's fine, right? This is the common theme here. We know it's the Flaperon. Let's try to use some of the reverse drift modeling data, right? And then hopefully we would have elucidated some more information from the barnacles, but obviously that's very questionable. But even the reverse drift modeling doesn't seem to put it where it's supposed to. Like I said, that was the big theme in your gap episode, is disregarding all that, it shouldn't even be here, right? Am I understanding that correctly?
The reason the Australians went to the length of getting the real Flaperon is that they couldn't make their drift modeling work. They made their simulated versions and they put it in the water and they watched how the wind pushed it in the waves. But they had really detailed data about what the waves were doing, what the currents were doing, what the wind was doing. And all of these things have different effects on different kinds of floating objects depending on how far they stick up, etc. And no matter how they ran the numbers, they couldn't get it to wind up in La Réunion in the proper time frame. And so they got this Flaperon. They put it out there and they got the numbers that made their models work. But their models only worked if the piece floated with the part sticking up. And this is exactly the issue, because from the minute the French got their hands on this piece and they looked at it, they noticed this discrepancy. The distribution of the barnacles told you that it floated submerged, but if you put it in water, it floats sticking out. And it has to float sticking out in order for the drift models to work, because it needs the wind to push it to La Réunion Island in the proper time frame. And so, yes, they spent an absolute ton of time, which we know because they made a really detailed report that they issued in 2017 explaining all the stuff they'd done, all their efforts to try to look at the marine life and they just couldn't make any of it work. None of it worked. So the interesting case about MH370 is that it looks differently from far away as from close up. Meaning, if all you know about this plane is that it disappeared in 2014 and then pieces of debris started washing ashore in 2015, you're like, okay, well, that's pretty clear what happened. It went in the ocean. But if you start looking closer, you're like, yes, but none of the pieces of debris has the right marine biology, et cetera, et cetera. It doesn't match the drift modeling, like nothing. It doesn't actually work.
Yeah, so it was even more than just the barnacles too, right? I think there was just the types of fouling and other species that were there just didn't add up.
Other organisms that were found didn't match what you'd expect to see. And then there's the whole other thing, you're asking about Blaine Alan. It turns out that most of the pieces of debris were found by a guy who had deep ties to Russia that he lied about, and he told conflicting stories about some of these pieces of debris. And nobody cares but me. Honestly, nobody cares but me. And it's weird.
Yeah, I mean the whole story of a modern day Indiana Jones, as you said it, showing up in the tropics with a leather jacket, camera crew, and 20-30 minutes he's finding the first piece. Like, if nothing else, incredulous is a very neutral way to describe it.
We're gonna get back to this idea, because there's, at the end of the day, when we are trying to make sense of the world and we hear stories and we're trying to assess evidence, it comes down to a gut feeling. Whether you're Albert Einstein or just a guy on the street, we hear something, we either believe it or we don't. And I might look at a UFO video and think, you've got to be kidding me. And other people might hear my story about the fact that Blaine Alan Gibson has a life partner who's a Russian guy he met as a teenager in central Russia, and he bought a condo for in D.C. when this guy went to work as a lobbyist in Washington, D.C. I'm like, this is too crazy. And people are just like, not even some of what I say people disbelieve, and a lot of people just ignore, which I find, I'm like, dude, I'm giving, this is my A material,
Truth is stranger than fiction often, that's just the way it turns out.
It really is. It really is.
So what I recall from watching the documentary on Netflix is that Blaine Alan Gibson was trolling the forums. He was just kind of observing the case and interested in it. And then someone on the forum said, why don't you check out the Reunion Islands at this particular shore? And he went there, and within 20 minutes, he found the piece. I mean, that alone is like, wait, who told you to go there? Who was it?
You're kind of mixing a bunch of different stories, but okay. What really happened, what really happened is that this guy was on my radar screen for a while because he had been part of the kind of the online community of people trying to figure it out, and he was traveling around the Indian Ocean basin. He like lived in Laos or Myanmar or something, and he had like a bar or something. It wasn't really clear, and he was like, "Oh, I met these guys, and they had this stuff called liquid eats metal or something." He thought that there was a spy plot to melt, like MH370 got melted by this weird mysterious substance that some people in Thailand told him about. I'm like, this is really bonkers stuff. But then he decided to like look for it, and he went to some oceanographer in Australia who told him, you should go look in this part of Mozambique. Because the Indian Ocean kind of goes in between the mainland of Africa and Madagascar, and it kind of makes a funnel. So if you look like on the African shore, there's you'll find it there. So Blaine goes to this island. He finds his first piece in 20 minutes. And I was like, what? Wow. There's a lot of skepticism about that time, and then more. But it did, and then he found more pieces with like camera crews rolling, like twice. He found pieces of camera crews rolling, and so people who are like, there's a lot of people who are like, well, yeah, he found all these pieces because there's a lot of pieces. There's a ton of pieces of debris that are like all over the shore of Africa, and I'm like, you think that because this guy finds them so easily, but like other people have been looking. He's not the only guy. There's actually a lot of people in Africa. And I talked to some guys who like ran a fishing expeditions to these islands off the coast of Africa. And I'm like, have you found any pieces? Because they were looking too. I mean, there was like a beach cleanup in Australia where they have 15,000 people on a certain weekend of the year. And like they got a handout saying like, look for pieces of this plane.
Yeah, so again, you follow the Inmarsat data, right? You should be finding pieces there, and you don't, and that's just the strange mystery, the multi-layered mystery here.
So that's what I want to ask you, Jeff. I mean, is that your belief that where we feel the plane may have crashed into the ocean, it's your feeling that the debris would have washed up in Australia based on the float charts?
In order for it not to wash up, this is kind of where Bayesian inference comes in, right? Because the fact that you didn't find it in Australia means that those parts of the seventh arc that have prevailing currents that go to Australia, and basically the further south you go, the more likely it is to wind up in Australia. And so it puts kind of a lower limit on the latitude that this plane could have crashed at, plausibly.
And just to be clear, right, I remember when we go up past the Strait of Malacca and then all of a sudden it turns south into the Indian Ocean, it seems like that's kind of like a 6-hour flight path that we're expecting it carried after losing all communication, sending out a mayday, which to me that raises an alarm, right? Like, wait a minute, this was only flying 2 hours tracked and then 6 hours untracked. To me, it's like, no, it probably crashed a little bit sooner to where we last saw that plane, right? But can you talk a little bit about the eyewitnesses that saw it? Is that a reason that many think that it also went so far south?
There's a kind of principle in air crash investigations that is a deeply held belief in air crash investigations that most other people don't even know about, which is that eyewitness accounts are generally worthless. They have no probative value whatsoever. People will report seeing things that didn't happen. And I think I feel like this idea is starting to leak out into the mass media. The idea that like convictions in criminal court based on eyewitnesses are just notoriously unreliable, inaccurate, and like all these people are getting freed on the basis of DNA evidence who are convicted on eyewitness testimony. But people intuitively trust eyewitness, and so you get like I don't even want to like say these words for fear of all the gates of hell it's going to unleash, but TWA 800 is a case that many, many people feel very passionately because there are eyewitnesses that saw like a missile go up and hit it. And we actually, I feel like have a pretty good idea of what actually happened to this plane. I think it was an accident. These fuel tanks blew up, but as I speak, someone is already typing in angry comments saying like, it was a missile shoot down. I guarantee it. And I really don't want to get into TWA 800, but I'm telling you that people feel very passionately about people think that it's the best evidence, and they will pin their entire theory on a group of villagers in the Maldives who say that they saw this plane with a blue and white logo on its tail.
Yeah, no, sure. I have my questions. I about 6 miles from an airport, an international one. I see them take off all day, and at about 10, 15 miles out, everything's a little speck in the sky. So seeing details after that is kind of
Yeah.
hard to wrap my mind around.
People don't notice planes, It's like a bird. Did a bird fly past your window? I don't know. Probably.
Yeah, yeah, yep.
Yeah, it almost seems to me like they'd have some sort of confirmation bias. Like, did you see it? The plane that crashed. You saw it,
Yep.
right? Yeah, I saw it. Yeah. They want to be special.
Some crazy white guy shows up in your village and is like, "Did you see this thing?" And you're like, "Yeah."
Yeah, tell him what he wants to hear. I do want to touch on and definitely refer to the episodes where you covered it, because you interviewed a couple good folks that are very knowledgeable about that. But just can you kind of summarize the whole vulnerability, right? Because you touched on a little bit before that the B777 is just one of those unique planes in the sky that just has all of these vulnerabilities, and it's different than its competitors like Airbus because of that access to the electronics. But again, do you just go into that a little bit and why you think that's so important to this case?
This plane had this particular flight had a whole number of things about it that, because it had these characteristics, it was vulnerable to being a very particular hack. In cybersecurity, if you want to get into a system, you study that system in great detail, and you realize maybe it wasn't put together in there might be a little crack in a crevice in the way it was put together. I'm speaking metaphorically here somewhat, but you can access it because of this vulnerability. And every system that people built can be hacked. Like famously, a couple of years ago, there was this iPhone that these people who had committed a terrorist attack had and the FBI really wanted to get this data, but Apple security is really, really good. But they got this Israeli company to
I was just gonna say, yeah, defense private contractor. Yep, nope, we got it already. We can hack it.
If you have a system,
yeah,
it can be hacked. And this particular flight had a whole bunch of things about it that, when you look at it in retrospect, you're like, okay, it was a 777 with an SDU that was made by Thales. It was flying entirely under the umbrella of a satellite that was low on fuel, so it was drifting in orbit, and on and on and on. And because of all of these characteristics, you could do this thing that would make the plane look like it went south when it really went north. And to my mind, that itself is a piece of evidence. Frankly, it's very few planes have this weird vulnerability. No plane ever has wound up producing the signals that would result if this attack was carried out. It's all just way too coincidental for my taste. So I think, like I said, I think it's a piece of evidence, the fact that this plane had this particular vulnerability. And if I can pull out just a little bit, because I think that when I often say that MH370 is important, it's not every plane crash is important. Every person who loves their missing victim is equally valid. But this one, I think, has ramifications. It has implications for world security. And if I can make that case really quickly, planes were built since the Wright brothers. There's been an ongoing mission to try to make them safer, meaning so that they won't break, the pilots won't fly them into the ground or into each other. And we've developed this really, really robust system for planes to be safe, so that they won't break or crash. And it's now a very, very safe way to get from A to B. There's another issue that has emerged since, let's say, 1990s. Everything is getting wired, everything is interconnected, everything is automated, and everything becomes now cyber vulnerable. And traditionally, cybersecurity has been not at all a consideration. Safety has been so paramount that security has been seen as a secondary or not completely irrelevant issue. And so as planes like the 777 came along, they were getting more and more sophisticated, but nobody had yet figured out that we don't live in an entirely safe neighborhood anymore. And sometimes you have to lock your door. And gradually they're starting to be aware of that, but unfortunately we're left with these legacy systems that were engineered at a time before anybody cared about this stuff. And now we're seeing the result of that. GPS is getting hacked and spoofed more and more in the world. Since last fall, there have been massive spoofing attacks where they don't just swamp the GPS signal so you don't know where you are. They actually send false information into your receiver to mislead you about where you're going. And so there have been cases of planes like almost flying into Iranian airspace. There was a report back in 2011. The Iranians used this kind of GPS spoofing to actually capture one of America's most advanced drones and have it land in Iran.
Wow.
So when I say that this is an important mystery, it's because I'm saying there's two possibilities with this plane. Either some crazy guy took this plane and committed suicide, and it was a 1 in a million thing that'll probably never happen again, and nobody really knows why he did it. And maybe we'll never find him, but it doesn't really matter because it's not really a threat. Or we live in a world in which a huge percentage of our infrastructure is cyber vulnerable, and there are actors out there who have the means, the motive, and the opportunity to wreak havoc when they want to. So so when I came up with this idea that maybe this plane had been hacked, that a vulnerability existed and maybe it was exploited, there were two important predictions that theory would make. One was that the plane would not be found in the southern seabed. The other was that we were under attack by an actor who was not only incredibly sophisticated and evil, but was so clever, so much more clever than us, that we were unable to even grasp the idea that this attack had been carried out. How vulnerable are we? I mean, you think about the dodo bird walking around on its island, and some sailor comes aboard with its stick, and the dodo's like, I have no idea what that is. And the sailor clubs him over the head, and the dodo's like, I have no idea what's happening to me, but my brain really hurts right now. So I'm trying to I'm going on CNN, and I'm saying, like, look, guys, there's this vulnerability that exists. I can't promise you that it was exploited, but it's something you should consider. And because I said that, I was kicked out of the independent group. And basically they stopped asking me on CNN, and I've basically been treated as a kind of, pariah is going too strong. They did put me on the Netflix show, but it has not been received. I have no evidence. I have no evidence whatsoever. Actually, I do have a piece of evidence. Actually, really recently, this is one of the great things about podcasting.
Yeah.
Let me tell you guys something great about podcasting, if I may.
Please, we're new.
People reach out to me and they tell me stuff, and a guy reached out to me. He's like, "This sounds like an Air Inc. 629 bus problem," and I'm like, Air Inc. 629, do tell me more. I'd heard this thing thrown around, but I didn't really know the significance of it. I mean, it's amazing that I've been pretty eyeball deep in this for 10 years, and I'm still learning stuff that blows my mind. It turns out that NASA, in I think April 2014, somewhere in 2014, they basically commissioned a report from a think tank in Washington that specializes in cybersecurity, and they said, please do a brief but quick assessment of cybersecurity vulnerabilities of U.S. aircraft. And this report came back in October, and they're like, they're all terrible, but the worst is the 777.
Oh, no. Nice.
And like here's a list of aircraft that you can update their software on all of the boxes in the plane, like remotely. And it's like 777.
Yeah.
It's like this is like I'm going to do an episode. I'm still digesting this, but it's amazing to me that, like, for all the public ridicule I got for talking about the potential that MH370 was a cybersecurity issue, the fact that, like, immediately after the plane disappeared, NASA has got this report that they've ordered, like, please tell us about the cybersecurity vulnerability of our aircraft. It's like,
right.
Yeah, I mean, that certainly seems relevant to this conversation. But hey, I loved what you were saying about how this is plausible. This is a possible thing that could have happened. I think where that falls short for me is the motive. And you also touched on that too. I don't want to put words in your mouth, but I do want you to talk a little bit about the passengers that were on the plane. I mean, does that play at all into what you kind of, as you put the pieces together, to say what might the motive have been? Passengers, cargo, secrets, right? There's got to be some reason. It wasn't just that this guy was some crazy guy, maybe the suicide theory, but is there anything that we just can point to on board that plane?
My most recent episode on the podcast is about motive. I did one last season too. It has to do with the geopolitical situation that pertained in March of 2014. It's the issue. It's incredibly interesting and rich and detailed and important, but I always get the least views for it. Like people don't want to hear about. It's like going back to
a little bit too detailed,
World
right?
Civ or something. Of course, that you fell asleep.
Yeah, we tried a Cold War episode. It didn't work out too well for us.
And it's like, yeah, and it kind of kills me because it's like it's kind of where I want to go with this, because if you understand what it's like to have a totalitarian state that's run by a former KGB officer and who in February, March 2014 is in the process of annexing Crimea, basically trying to take over a neighboring country without triggering a World War III, without triggering a massive Western response, doing all kinds of dirty tricks. And I said, like, what does my theory predict? And like I said, like this idea that there's a malicious act there, but it specifically predicted that, or the fear that I had, the fear that motivated me was the idea that what if Russia in particular is able to carry out an attack as scarily complicated and as scarily ruthless as this, completely consequence-free. Like, not only are they not having to deal with any consequences, but like no one even knows they did it. Or maybe if the American intelligence figured out that they did it, it's too complicated. They can't go to the New York Times and say this is what happened, because the New York Times won't believe them. In fact, I've never said this in public before. I used to be roommates with the editor of the New York Times, the top editor of the New York Times, and in 2015, in that summer, I went to visit him. He wasn't the head guy there yet. And I told him, look, I was very excited. I was like, look, there's all this stuff I found. And it's like, I think this is what happened to the plane. And his wife was very mean to me. Actually, she's like, that's ridiculous. Oh, no. That's ridiculous. I hope this doesn't come back to bite me in the ass that I just told this story. But people at the highest level know that this theory is out there, and they have not taken it seriously. And I am lumped with the Ashton Forbeses of the world. I mean, many of the right-thinking people of the world call me. I mean, I have friends who are like, "Oh, you're a conspiracy theorist. You might be interested in this other. Turns out they're going to search Loch Ness again. Aren't you interested in that?" I'm like, I'm trying to do something serious. I'm trying to do something urgent, and like the world is not taking me very seriously, but that's okay.
Well, you have a two-tiered problem with that. I mean, listen, just honestly speaking, right? I'm on the right, Mike's on the left. That's the whole point of this show, is to find common ground. But I deal with the exact same thing. Let's say, hey, somebody foreign may have interfered with some sort of device or infrastructure that may or may not have been connected to the internet, may or may not have been hackable. In this case, maybe talking about election equipment. You get ostracized for saying that, right? And I'm definitely not going down that route right now. But the truth is that this is the same kind of deal. And it's actually surprising that, though, maybe I'm being biased here, but someone at the New York Times or someone at CNN, they would want to silence you on a theory along that route, right?
Whoa. Let me super be clear. I am a creature of the establishment, right? I work in like mainstream media. I write for Vanity Fair. I went to Harvard. Like my ex-roommate runs the New York Times. It's like, I know how the world actually works.
If we prick your finger, you bleed centrist.
Well, no, but that's another issue.
All right, maybe I won't box.
But no, but I know I do know how the world actually works, and I do know how people form their opinions. And when I've talked to the people who are like, oh, Inmarsat, it's all cooked up, it's all CIA operations. Like, I've talked to the people at Inmarsat. Like, I know I've talked to a lot of engineers in my life. I've talked to people who are do their jobs. And I feel like I understand why they think the way they think. And it has to do, sometimes I think that my main enemy is a thing I call reasonableism. Reasonableism is linked to this idea, the Overton window, which I'm sure you guys are familiar with. This idea that there's certain ideas that are okay. There's some ideas that are almost okay. And then there's ideas that are not okay. And the Overton window will shift in time. But the idea of a pilot committing suicide is pretty alarming, but we know it happens, or we have pretty strong suspicion it happens. The idea that a plane could be hacked, it's never happened before. And so people are always throwing around this idea of Occam's razor. It's another thing that drives me crazy. Occam's razor. Simple explanations are best. Simple explanations are best unless you're trying to understand cryptocurrency, in which case simple explanations will not get you far, my friend. If I can do a little discursion here, I don't know if you guys saw Oppenheimer, but before that movie came out, I had gotten really interested in quantum mechanics. Quantum mechanics is an absolutely insane idea that will never lie inside of anyone's Overton window. The world, it turns out, works in a fundamentally, totally crazy way. But and it's all and to understand it, you have to like go down a rabbit hole that's 100 times deeper than MH370, and involves math that is absolutely hard and bonkers. But
just to conceptualize, right? You got Schrodinger's cat, superpositioning. You know, we all exist as either wavelengths or particles. So
the idea that simple is best really does not apply to quantum mechanics. But if you stick it through and you deal with the complexity, what you can do is blow up the world, because it lets you understand nuclear physics and it lets you build atom bombs. And it's an amazing how a bunch of young guys, like in their 20s, in the 1920s and 30s, piece by piece, put together this really bonkers theory of the universe that then, and some of them had to flee Hitler because World War II was about to happen. And then a whole bunch of these guys that got taken to New Mexico, and they used their knowledge that they just figured out to build a bomb that could destroy humanity. It's unbelievable. The 20th century is unbelievable. How we went from, my grandfather was born in 1899. It was like horse and buggy land.
Right.
And by the time my grandfather died, there was like, people walk around the moon, nuclear power plants, etc. It's incredible what these guys figured out, like a very crazy mathematical idea, and we basically ripped the veil from reality. We understood at microscopic level how reality works. And the way that reality works is not simple. And if you walk around following Occam's razor, you're fundamentally not understanding the world that you live in.
So, Jeff, I have to respond to this. I mean, if our listeners are, and I'm hearing this correctly, right? You're doubting some Inmarsat ping data. We're talking about.
No, I'm not doubting Inmarsat data. I'm saying that there's two ways that we understand this data came out of a box that works by physical principles, right? And there's two mechanisms by which that physical piece of equipment can produce the signals that were received. I'm giving you a very specific mechanism. I'm not saying that Putin hates America or whales can communicate with UFOs. I'm telling you, this box was made by a company in France, and it performs a thing called Doppler precompensation using a specific algorithm that requires navigational information put over an Airink 629 bus from the electronics bay that is accessible through an unlocked hatch.
Right.
I'm going to tell you the exact vulnerability and the possibility that is exploited. I'm not just whiffing vapors,
Fair enough. Well, what I was going to also say, and I'm grateful for your clarification there, I really am, because it does make sense. You're calling into question the data or the legitimacy or the veracity of it.
I'm not calling into the question. I'm saying there's an alternative explanation by which it was generated, but I'm giving you a specific mechanism. I'm not just, because this is the problem, because I'm dealing with people like Florence Deschangy who are saying, like, I wouldn't trust an American as far as I can throw him. And a guy in a parking lot told me that the Americans knew all about it. I'm like, that's not approach. That is not a useful approach.
It's dealing with that plausibility, right? It's, again, tying back to the Bayesian, right? If I'm understanding that, it's figuring out all the probabilities that could have led you to this data. And again, the plane where it should have been wasn't. So it's kind of a head scratcher, right? So
I told you that I had this conversation with Green Dot the other day, and he said, like, I just don't. He said, I'm sorry, but I believe that the pilot did it. And I'm like, listen, the word belief is the killer. You must not believe. We live in a world where belief is a sacred thing. No, don't believe. I want you to not believe. I want you to be able to incorporate in your mind the fact that there's multiple possible ways by which the data that we have could have been generated. I want you to try to understand all of them.
I think you did a really great job across all of those episodes, because that's so important, is that you're trying to give us all the information to not form any one specific conclusion, but just look at the entire case in detail. You start, again, like you tell us how to look at the case, and then look at each of them. And again, I'm a guy who started from the official narrative, right? It seemed to make sense. They found some flight simulator data that roughly correlated to where Inmarsat would say that they might have found the plane. But as you follow each piece, it becomes harder and harder to follow that narrative, right? Again, it's just it's a mystery.
So
very well put. I mean, exactly.
Yeah, Jeff, I don't want to mischaracterize what you're saying, so please do stop me, and I'm grateful you are. My point and what I'm getting at is we're talking about inconsistencies. Is that fair to say? Okay, and we're talking about discrepancies with the debris, whether or not it even was from this plane, how it was found, all of that. And then you just brought up quantum mechanics. We interviewed.
I was using
Ashton
quantum
Forbes.
mechanics just as an example of how Occam's razor can fail as a strategy. But sorry,
And that's the perfect example for this conversation too, though, because that is what Ashton Forbes' theory is, right? That is what he's saying, that this is some sort of quantum superconductor technology that they're able to abduct the plane. So listen, I'm not trying to offend you. I'm not trying to mischaracterize what you're saying. But when you go down that line of thinking, it's almost interesting to say, wow, one side here, they have a lot of similarities in that the big Venn diagram here, but obviously there's such specific differences where one of them is saying, this is what happened. And I think you're more saying, this is what could have happened. Am I getting it right?
The moon is similar to a round piece of cheese in many regards. They both are round, and they both have holes, and maybe they're both made of cheese. I don't know. I would say that Ashton and I are as similar as the moon and a piece of cheese, because Ashton is a very different kind of fish from me. And it gets down again. I think that the point I've been kind of trying to drive home again and again is that it's about the approach. Okay, I don't care what you think. I've been drawing the analogy like of a beauty pageant, right? Let's bring all of our little theories up on stage, and whichever theory is the most beautiful, we're going to put a crown on it and call it the winning theory. I don't care what the most beautiful theory is. I want to know where the plane is. This plane went somewhere on March 8th, and I want to know where it is, because I think it really, really matters to actually world history. I think this is world historically important. And so I'm not trying to convince you of anything. What I am trying to do is to say that there is an alternate explanation that I would like you to consider. That's all I'm saying. If for me, the finish line, for me, the trophy I want to grab is for the Australian government and for any kind of international body to say, we're going to take seriously the possibility that this was a cyber hack. And actually, one of the huge achievements of season 1 of the show, of Deep Dive MH370, was I got a really respected cybersecurity researcher on tape saying, your vulnerability is plausible, and I think we really need to take a look at it because this plane was not found on the southern seabed. So this is something we need to take seriously. So for a person in that business who's real to say that the mechanism that you've proposed is potentially valid, not that it's true, but that this is that this vector existed. That's what I'm trying to get people to at least acknowledge. So, what we have, I work in a very complex informational environment, right? I'm surrounded. I have on the one hand authorities who are 100% convinced that they're right, and when they can't find the plane, they just say, "Well, we know we were right, so we can't really explain why we didn't find the plane." But we're not going to write any more checks, so good night. And then I have people like Ashton who are just kind of pooping clouds of smoke out their butt. And that's what it is. I mean, you call it a theory. I think that in the time I've spent on MH370, I've come to believe that you need to draw a distinction between a theory, which is a model of the world based on some correlation with evidence, which has predictions that it will make, that can be tested. So I'm constantly trying to think about, like, what can I do to test this idea, right? And Ashton and people like, and Ashton is one of millions of people. And some of these people are actually pretty well regarded. They have reputations. I don't know where Ashton came from. He fell off a bus, and all of a sudden there's this guy named Ashton Forbes who's got a video, which I do actually want to say a couple things about this video. But in terms of, like, it's quantum mechanics, and somebody was free-scale semiconductors, and China was trying to build a new chip, and the mangastenes were next to the lithium-ion batteries, and it all caught fire, and then the U.S. shot it down. It's like it's like this kind of, like, bad acid trip of just every idea kind of swirling together, and it doesn't add up to anything. It doesn't let you make any predictions. If you try to find an expert find an expert in quantum mechanics who says that and saying something what you're saying. There's actually to get it back to like the classic quantum mechanics of the 1930s. Like someone said to Niels Bohr, one of these guys, he told him the theory, and the response was, "Your theory isn't even wrong." It's like it's not even wrong. So Ashton's theory is truly not even wrong.
Right. You're saying that almost it's just out there. It is what it is. It doesn't prove anything.
Is it out there? I mean, is an Oreo cookie a theory about MH370? It doesn't have the characteristics that make it a theory. It's just noises coming out of somebody's mouth. And I do want to say something about this video. To a certain extent, I see this video and I'm like, I can't even, right? I mean, it's like, okay, let me ask you this. 3 orbs. First of all, you have to understand there's never been. Okay, I understand we all want to solve the mystery of MH370, but the whole other issue is like, are UFOs real? Right? And so he's like, in one video, he's done 2 like world historical things. He's found MH370, and he solved the question of whether UFOs exist. Okay, great. There's never been in the history of mankind a video of UFOs as clear as that. Now you're going to get more hate mail about this. Okay, let me just, as I'm ranting, because I've got a good head of steam.
I will just clarify. He does not think that they're UFOs. I will clarify that, but I do understand.
So this thing goes into a bloop. I mean, a still from a video game, we know, right? But okay, so let's imagine it's not just like pirated from some like 2003, Xbox game or whatever it was. But let's pretend it's real. What is that? Oh, he's discovered a new kind of physics. Okay, great. So he's found MH370, proved the existence of not UFOs, but something like UFOs, and time portals. Time portals are one of these things that like, they're not real. I mean, they're not real. They exist. They're plentiful in, straight to cable science fiction movies, but they don't exist. They don't exist. I'm sorry. And so you're showing me a portal. You're showing me a movie about MH370 disappearing into a portal. A portal. Portals aren't real, okay? Just to be clear.
I mean, Jeff, I agree with you. I'm going to start by saying that I agree with what you said. I agree that these videos likely are not real. Okay. What I would say, because Mike is my friend and all of my friends hate me because I play the devil's advocate and whatnot. So I would say, right, is 10 years ago, if I were to say a plane was hacked through cybersecurity means or through cyber, we would say that's not possible.
Correct. Yeah, the Overton window. Yeah.
Right. But maybe in 50 years, we'll be saying endothermic reactions happen all the time. And oh my God, 50 years ago, we didn't even think they were a real thing. So I would say, right, maybe we are talking about 2 different Overton windows here.
Possibly.
Yeah. No, I can't. I have no response to that. But okay, let me say one more thing.
Yeah.
Which is that, and I'm sure he has an answer to this, but this is the other thing that really kind of bugged me right out the gate. MH370 didn't vanish. The problem with MH370, people say, oh, it's the plane that disappeared. Well, it disappeared, but it didn't disappear like that, right? It flew for 6 hours. It sent some signals. The authorities thought that they understood what these signals meant, but when they went to look in the area where the signals said the plane went, it wasn't there. That's the mystery of MH370. The mystery of MH370, it would have been much easier if it had just, like, it could, this is one of the other crazy things about MH370. If this guy wanted to commit suicide, he could have just kept on going. He could have kept going straight. He would have been the South China Sea. There's no radar. Right. Just turn the boxes off and go, and no one will ever find you. It's simple. He doesn't need to do this crazy fourth dimensional chess things. But I guess Ashton's saying like the plane turned south and then like it got blipped, but then like Inmarsat was faking the data so that it looked like it was going into southern Indian Ocean, but it was really going to the Maldives.
Correct. Yes.
But like,
yes.
I mean, a plane. Here's the thing: a plane is an object that is designed to go from point A to point B quickly, right? So why do you need to have a time warp, white hole, to the Maldives? Is that what he's saying? He went to the Maldives? So why did you fly there? Why did you go through a time portal?
I think the claim is laid that it might be at Diego Garcia base, but I think that's kind of a point too, is that if it was teleported, why are these parts showing up? But I did also want to deep dive into just radar, right? Because not Inmarsat, but specifically radar. And you did touch on
primary radar.
Yeah, exactly. And that's some of the questions, right? Is why don't we have more radar data? And I'll don't want to take the words out of your mouth. I think you covered it. Why we might not have radar data from some of these countries.
Yeah, it's interesting that people do have kind of a model of the world that they just sort of. I mean, we all have a model of the world that's mostly assumptions, right? And so, you go to a new city and you go to a bus stop and you figure a bus is probably going to show up because that's what bus stops are for, buses showing up. And similarly, people are like, well, I know that there's such a thing as military radar, and I know that they're looking for planes. So if this plane flew over 7 or 8 countries going north, and then they must have been seen. And that's not actually how it works. I mean, radar is actually expensive, and it covers a fairly small area compared to the surface of the Earth. And so, I mean, my theory could be proven wrong tomorrow if Nepal comes forward and says, hey, here's our radar tape of that entire night and there's nothing on it and there's no way you could hide a 777. Then that would put paid to it, but it hasn't happened yet.
Yeah, no, I think you tied into that, right? There's some nuances to that, right? The expense, but also it's just if you're not in an active war, you might not be looking in that direction, right? I think that's some of the key things that people think. You assume that we're all at full attention, checking the beeps and sweeps to make it out there, but also you touched on how they could be used to, kind of reference back where your entire radar grid is. So you're kind of pulling your pants down and exposing yourself to, potential adversaries of your whole system, right? So that might be a reason why they weren't on too. Yeah, I think the slow release and the incomplete release from the information upset a lot of people too early on. Malaysia Airlines itself, and I think a lot of people got sacked ultimately and were kicked out. Am I understanding that right?
The Prime Minister of Malaysia at the time was ultimately kicked out of office and then sent to jail, if I'm not mistaken. It turned out he was super corrupt. And there's a lot of people who are very quick to see connection between this massive scandal called 1MDB, where like billions of dollars were stolen, and like this guy's, I don't know the details. But yeah, the Malaysians are not that open, and I frankly think they were confused. I think they didn't understand. I mean, it's super complicated stuff, and I think when the Prime Minister got up and said, "Hey, we've analyzed these signals, and we know that the plane went south." I think that's true that they did analyze the signals and come to that conclusion. I don't think that he himself understood the science. I think the scientists told him that that's what they'd concluded, and he was like, "Okay."
Yeah, and they definitely asked for the help of governments like Australia. And that was one of the things that I didn't really understand from Ashton's side, as well as how did the U.S. get involved into this? And actually, I do want to ask you, I mean, was the U.S. involved in search efforts? Did we issue statements? Because it seems like, why would the U.S. get involved over this? There was only, I think, 1 or 2 Americans on the plane anyway.
So by treaty, all of this stuff is covered by international treaty, right? And so the country of, it was Malaysian Airlines. It originated in Malaysia. It was a Malaysian captain. So they had primary responsibility just by treaty. And then because the plane wound up in Australia, they believed, Australia was kind of delegated the search and rescue authority. America had a sort of associated status because they built the plane. America has built the plane. But America also can get involved in situations, even if Boeing didn't make the plane, because America has a really kind of world famous accident investigation agency, the NTSB, okay. And so if we can help out, the FAA, if we can help out, we will, if we're asked to.
Okay, interesting. Yeah. Yep.
So in this case, the FBI was given this computer data to analyze. Supposedly, it's all under layers of like. A thing that people find suspicious, but I don't find suspicious, is that if an investigation is going on, you can't comment on it. You can't talk about it. They will send your FOIA request back. And so people are still sending FOIA requests to the FAA asking for everything they've got in MH370, and the letter they get back saying we won't respond to an ongoing investigation. So it is an ongoing. The one thing that tells us is that it is an ongoing investigation.
Yeah, that was going to be my next question. You're right. I don't find that sketchy. I think that's their process. It makes sense. But okay, so the last thing I have on my notes here that I want to touch on is that recent report that came out actually this year in May. I think it was May 2nd. where it talked about acoustic detections and like the setup of all of our detection devices. The report says it wasn't properly heard. It may have heard. Has this report come across your proverbial radar in the last month or so?
It was from Nature. It was the journal Nature.
Oh, yeah, I didn't see that. I know that people have been thinking about the acoustic pings for a long time. I think that it's a kind of a signal to noise ratio issue where like there's certain, there's a lot of noise and it's hard to know. I don't think there was anything ever conclusive that was really claimed about it. So I didn't really get too involved.
Yeah. So I thought about the Titan submarine that was just going to go explore the Titanic, and they went on this 5-day search effort after the sub disappeared. And it was 5 days later, the Navy was like, yeah, we detected that on our acoustic device. We knew there was a ping over there. And I think the report said, like you said, it was a little bit inconclusive, or it said these should have fired, but they didn't, or they are offline for this small exact period of time. I mean, so again, it's another thing that raises these questions. What kind of government organizations are orchestrating this or involved or changing and manipulating things behind or after the fact? And maybe they're not, right? But that's what makes this conversation so interesting.
Yeah, no, it's interesting. But I mean, I guess the sort of bottom line for me is it's fine to have different ideas. It's necessary to have different ideas. I think I was saying something to go offline that I think is worth saying again, which is that science is a collective effort. It's all about reaching collaboration, consensus, and it requires trust. It requires good faith efforts. It requires an ability to not be too wedded to your ideas, because ultimately, if we're all trying to convince each other of our ideas, but each of us is wedded through steel handcuffs to their own idea, then it's a completely fruitless undertaking. And so I don't want to, as I said before, I don't really want to convince anyone that my particular explanation is right. And I don't want you to believe my theory, but I do want to try to, as a collective, work through the evidence, try to understand what it means, understand the limits of what we know, because there really isn't actually all that good. For instance, we don't have a great understanding of how lepus anatiphora barnacles grow in different bodies of water. And if we had a better understanding, we might have more clarity about the debris. So we're all working with we're working within our limitations, but those, we could be reaching a much better understanding of the situation if we approach it the right way. So I'm trying to model how I think one answers a question. The first episode of the first season was, how do you find a missing plane? What is the approach that you take? And it's basically the scientific method. And people like Ashton frustrate me because to me it's noise and distraction, and it's a lot of sound and fury signifying nothing. It's not the way you do it. And I welcome your ideas. If you can bring me a quantum mechanics expert who will tell me that, Heisenberg's uncertainty principle can shed some light on how the evidence that we have was generated, I will listen with all ears. But you have to understand that as someone who's been in the public eye on this issue for a decade, I get all kinds of stuff over the transom. I'm sure you can imagine. And a lot of it, like you're 3 paragraphs in and you're like, okay.
What did I get myself
this
into
is
reading
not
it?
Going well.
Yeah.
Well, very interesting. I mean, Jeff, we've touched on so much. I know that there is so much, and we want to push people to go and check out your podcast, season 2. And like you said, it's coming out now, or, tell me what episode you're on, but where can we find you? How do we get in touch with you? And how do we send you our crazy, wacky theories? What do you want people to know in closing here?
So deepdivemh370.com is the show page. I just started a new YouTube channel. I'm basically taking a new approach with the second episode, asking the same kinds of questions, but just doing it solo this time, reaching out to a whole wider range of experts, hopefully. But yeah, I do try to make it a community. I want people to ask questions, make comments, feed me tips. We have to do it together. And you guys are great. You guys, I love your approach. I think you guys are very smart, and you're open-minded, and you're you understand, what the issues are and everything. And I think I really appreciate it. It's great. And, sort of opening it up like a little wider, it's been a real revelation to me over the last year or so to get into podcasting, and it's so lateral. It's not like, because when I was coming up, everyone was trying to get into the New Yorker and like with the New York Times, and this is much more about like, hey, I like the work you're doing. Will you come on my show? And will you come on my show? And it's neat. It's really fun and it's interesting. And like it pays as badly. Like we're as broke as ever, but at least we have some sense of control over what we're talking about and who we're talking to, and the ability to just really, get feedback from readers and to be in direct contact with readers is awesome. Viewers and listeners.
Well, we've had a lot of fun, and if nothing else, it gives us this motivation to kind of research things and actually figure out. We don't want to be spouting BS, right? So we try to parse through some of what we're hearing and review the review of the next week we have. But hey, man, we're really grateful. It was our privilege to have you on today. We're going to link everything down below. Mike, what did I miss? Is there anything you want to close us out with?
Sure. I also noticed he's got, some books behind him. As you can see, I'm a reader as well, so I have to put you on the spot here. When I buy your book, you can send, signed copy for me, right? Of course.
Somebody actually asked me for a signed copy, and I was like, I love the idea of sending you a signed copy, but like, I'm gonna have to go down to the post office, and like, honestly, like every day I slip further and further behind. So, I mean, I'm just like. There's this idea. I did a book.
We'll have to get
I did a book about fear
service.
I did a book about fear called "The Extreme Fear of the Science of Your Mind in Danger." And there's an idea in it that my wife and I use all the time, which is that as your cognitive tunnel gets narrower and narrower, as the stress builds, like as you're trying to save your plane, you can't do as much, and so you do a thing called task shedding. So from time to time, we'll be like, "Honey, can you go get the kids?" And I'm like, "I'm task shedding." We're like, "Okay." I'm task shedding.
All right. So the post office for you is entirely written
Mike
off.
ain't getting a signed copy here.
Doesn't sound like
I would
it.
love to. I mean, I know sometimes people just send labels, but I feel like is that like a solution to the problem, or is that just that's?
Like I said, if I gotta get a task rabbit or a courier to your door, I'll figure it out. Don't you worry.
I'll do that. I'll do that. I appreciate the support. I really appreciate the support. As you can tell, this is something that means a lot to me. It's something I feel is really important, and it's so interesting on YouTube to kind of slowly build an audience and try to slowly connect to people, and people are like, "Oh, that's interesting, actually." So thank you for giving me an opportunity to talk about this stuff. If I wasn't talking to you, I'd be talking to my cat about it. So it's much more interesting to talk to you guys.
Sure thing. The privilege was ours, more than just, as a, very prominent investigator on this. It was really nice to hear your insights just about journalism and podcasting, Thank you for that.
Yeah, my pleasure. Hey, guys.
Thank you, Jeff. Thank you.
Anytime.
Well, this has been Elevated Thoughts.